Sheldon is a fellow in the Institute, and he's speaking to us from Minneapolis, and he is a full-time specifier for a large architectural firm. And Sheldon has served on a number of national committees, and I've been active in CSI for many, many years, decades even.
Ooh, sounds scary.
Okay, Sheldon, take it away.
All right. So anyway, and this is not my original thought, but I think specs are a lot longer than they need to be. And I remember way back in those days when I joined CSI, some elder member told me, well, there can't be any such thing as long and short specs, because if you can take it out to make the specs short, it shouldn't have been there in the first place. And I believe in that. We'll see if our slides are going here. And historically, specifications used to be very short, and I'll show you that in a second here. But they had to grow because at one time architects actually were in charge of everything. And that's no longer the case, as I will also show you. And when I was a student, I worked at the records department at the University of Minnesota, and I noticed a couple of things about the construction documents. And the two impressive things were that in the 100-year-old buildings, the specs were very small. And in the new buildings, they were very large. And similarly, the number of drawings required grew immensely over that 100 years. The other thing was how the specs were written, and they were written more or less in the stream of consciousness style. And then the later specs, of course, using master format and section format, things were very much organized. But the thing that was interesting is that the old specs really didn't need to be that organized. And that's because they were short. Now here's a building, Falwell Hall, built about 100 years ago. It's a real building, steel frame, brick, marble, all kinds of good stuff in it. And I would ask you, how many drawing sheets do you think it took to do this building? And how big is the project manual? I won't take answers on that because somebody always lowballs it, and says 2 pages or something. Well, it wasn't quite that. In fact, it was built with 58 sheets of drawings and a 51-page project manual. And of course, if the project manual is only 51 pages, you don't need to worry too much about organization because you should be able to read the whole thing and get everything out of it. For comparison, we recently did a church. There was 85,000 square feet, and we had nearly 200 drawings and a 2-volume project manual, which is pretty typical today. So the question is, how did we get there?
Sheldon, I worked on an airport project recently, and our consultant who designed and specified the baggage handling system had a specification section on the baggage handling system that itself exceeded 51 pages.
Yeah, well, when you need a table of contents for your specifications, maybe something's wrong there. I don't know. Well, so we're going to do a little history lesson in here, and we're going to go back to 1911, and that was the time the first AIA conditions were published. And they stated that the architect was in complete control. And of course, if that's the case, then, if you're actually going to tell the contractor what to do, then specifications have to grow. But still, they were pretty much much less than they are today. And here's just a brief overview of what happened. And you see that today, just the table, or just the general conditions, is almost as long as the original project manual. So here we are in 1911, and it says the architect shall have general supervision and direction of the work, and he has authority to stop the work. That really neat phrase that we like so much. So here he is. He's in complete control. So what happened? Why did things get bigger? Well, a few things are there. Attorneys, of course, got involved, and they like to say in a page what you can say in a couple of sentences. And I think I actually wasn't around back then, but the stories here, I have a sense that maybe workers were, more committed to their jobs. I mean, they weren't going from one place to another. They apprenticed in. And today you go out on a job site, and the guy who's putting your roofing on might have been flipping burgers last week at McDonald's. But the real thing was the law of unforeseen consequences. So I'm pretty sure that when the architects wrote those general conditions, when they were saying, I'm in charge of the project, they were thinking about the construction part. And they weren't thinking about job safety, which became a real big thing. In 1961, there was a lawsuit. Here it is. The boiler was installed without the thermostat. They test fired and the boiler blew up and killed a guy. And the court ruled that the architect was charged with supervision of the work and was, according to general conditions, responsible for everything, was liable. And it went to an appeals court, and that court agreed with the lower court, and not only that, but increased the amount of damages. It eventually went to, I think it might have even been the Supreme Court, where that was overturned, but still it scared the heck out of the architects. And so just like a year after the suit was over, AI revised and reissued the general conditions. And so we're starting to distance ourselves here, and the architect will make periodic visits and determine in general if the work is proceeding according to contract documents. No exhaustive or continuous on-site inspections, but they kept the stop the work thing. And that ended up to be a problem because they kept getting sued.
Sued for not stopping the work.
Well, yeah, right, because they should have done it to save the worker. So here we are in 66, and I'm sorry I got to do this to you. We've got some reading here to do. But again, we're looking here, periodic visits, and now the contractor, for the first time here, is identified as the person who's supposed to supervise and direct the work, and is solely responsible for everything. And of course, the last one there, the contractor is supposed to basically pay for everything required to do the project. Go up to 67. Now we specifically state that the architect is not responsible for construction means and methods and all that kind of stuff. Go up to 1970. Now here it is. We finally took it away. The architect can no longer stop the work. Only the owner can. And 76, we've reduced the regular visits to whenever we feel like it. 1987, they emphasize the fact that the architect is not responsible because the contractor is. And finally, and this is 2007 version, and they're in 4.2.2, it's the same thing basically. The contractor or the architect will visit the site, has no control over means and methods. And in the commentary to the AIA 207, AI says, the last sentence underscores the statement of the contractor's responsibilities and reinforces the dividing line between the contractor's responsibilities and those of the architect. And that's the heart of the whole matter. I think we're specifying a lot of things that we shouldn't be. There was also, in 97, what I call the crystal ball clause. Prior to that time, the contractor was required to produce the intended results. In 97, they changed that to indicate, which I think is only fair for the contractor. So there we are, the contractor is responsible for everything, and to me that makes sense. Now I know some of you are going to get your undies in a bundle, but the contractor knows more about how to run the job, the manufacturers know more about their products, and the subs know more about installation than the architect can possibly know. Now I know we all have our favorite little things that, we got burned on a roofing project, and so we know all about roofing, or we know all about some other thing, but if you take all the products in aggregate, the architect cannot possibly know all the things he has to know to write complete specifications. And we don't even visit the site much anymore. And here's a real live sample here from my life. Here's the mock-up. 2 weeks later, I'm sure you'll agree that's probably not the same as the mock-up. So,
Sheldon, I just wanted to ask if that was the architect's blood on that first sample after having argued with the contractor about the mock-up.
Yeah, it's funny, my wife looked at the picture and she said, it looked like a kindergartner did that. So anyway, so here we are, we're 100 years later, and we have to, stop and ask what's really required. And here again, the intent is to include all items necessary and the contractor, and this is a commentary too from AIA, that the contractor is expected to make reasonable inferences, and here they say, like, if you show a gypboard wall, then it should be reasonable that the contractor would figure out some way to hang the gypboard on the wall. I think that's a bit weak, but this is AIA saying this, and they're the guys that are writing the general conditions. So anyway, it just seems to me that, you know, because the contractor is responsible for everything, the architect's responsibility is to show what it's supposed to look like when it's done and to identify those materials that we actually care about. So I think this would probably be a good time for a brief break here if anybody has any comments or questions here before we go on. And I don't, can I see if somebody asks a question, or how does that work?
Nobody has any current questions. There's a
All right.
There's a sort of a chat box that with questions.
All right. And again, okay. So anyway, it's like I said, the general conditions are very clear that the architect is supposed to show what the thing is supposed to look like, and it's the contractor's responsibility to figure out everything else. And it's redundant because twice it shows up in the responsibility of the contractor. It says these are the contractor's responsibilities, and in the architect's responsibilities it says these are not the architect's responsibilities. Okay, so we'll move on from there. Now Division 1 is great. I love Division 1, and in some respects you could say that much of what's there might be inferable from the general conditions, but I don't think I'll go quite that far. But look what we have there. We've got a section for like selection of building materials. We say that identical parts should be interchangeable. We tell them to comply with regulations, comply with the manufacturer's instructions. We deal with all these things, and properly used, Division 1 eliminates the need to restate things in other specification sections, and yet, especially manufacturer's instructions or specifications, you see this, but I look online a lot and I look at specifications for different projects, and it always seems that there's stuff in the specs that was covered in Division 1 and yet it's restated in separate sections. You know, for instance, you might say, you know, store everything above ground and keep it dry. That's Division 1. And then every section after that they say the same things. Well, here's something you can get rid of. Interesting story here. In the mid-90s, I worked on the specifications subcommittee, and at that, it was really exciting. Met a lot of really smart people there, and I was still relatively new to CSI, so it was a great experience for me. But at one of the meetings, part of the committee's responsibility, in fact, all of it was to maintain spec text and spec guides. And in one of the meetings, we had, come on, there you go. You used to see this statement at the beginning of every spec section. And at one of the meetings, I said, well, you know what manual practice says you shouldn't do that. Because the manual practice said you can state once in the supplementary condition how all these things tie together, and then you're done. You're done. You've said it. And interestingly, the committee agreed with that. And I was off the committee not much later, so I don't know if they ever got around to implementing that, but basically we all agreed you do not need to state this in every spec section. Well, here we are, how many years later, and you don't see this very often, but what you do see is countless references to Division 1 in other parts of the spec section. So we went from one reference to references scattered all the way through a typical spec section. And if you were to just remove those, some spec sections, I think you could probably cut a half page out right there just by taking out those references. And, okay, come on, here we go. And speaking of needless references, I kind of get a kick out of the recommendation that in the table of contents you indicate if you're not using a division that you state the division name and title, name and number, and then say not used. Well, logically, I think then your table of contents should include every spec section in master format and followed by not used for the ones you're not using. And by extension, of course, you can get into the spec sections themselves and list every article title and say they're not used if they're not used. I mean, it's just a little thing, the not used up in the table of contents, but I just don't understand the logic for that. Someone once said, well, that's to make sure the contractor knows that you didn't have Division 10, for example. Well, I think it's a lot more likely that you would miss something at the specification level than you would at the division level on the table of contents. So that's one of my pet gripes there. Also, the number of pages in the table of contents, again, it's a little thing, but it's repeating information that you don't really need to do.
Sheldon, we had a question or a comment from Paul Gerber about the references to Division 1. He says that because many subs don't get Division 1, let alone the general or supplemental conditions, that it might make some sense to let them know that there are requirements for preparing submittals or one thing and another that are in Division 1, and to put them on notice that they need to ask the GC to look at Division 1 to find those things out.
Well, I've heard that argument, and you start down that road, where do you draw the line? You refer to like every article title in the general conditions, or you refer to every part of Division 1. I mean, the point is, it's a single document. You have your project manual, and I hate to say this, but that's not my problem. It's the general contractor, the prime contractor's problem, and the sub's problem. The fact that they don't distribute the documents is their problem, not ours. And again, I don't know where you draw the line. I mean, you could say, well, do we have to tell them that they have to have a driver's license if they drive? It just seems to me there's a pretty clear line right now in the general conditions, and why would you cross that line? Similar thing, you see a lot of people have related work sections, and I think the intent there was that they be used to indicate to the reader where they might find things that they would reasonably expect to find in that section. And yet I see many specifications where the list of related items is just about anything you can think of. And there again, if you go down that road, you could conceivably argue that everything in the project is related to everything else, so why not just repeat the table of contents there? And you have to remember too that when people sign bid forms, they're signing a document that says they read everything, they understand it, and the contractor especially, is the guy who's in charge of everything. So, I've heard that argument ever since I got into specs. It's like, well, I didn't get that section. And you know what? That's tough. That's a contractor's problem. Of course, today it's a lot easier because we do all of our distribution electronically now, and people just get the entire project manual. So there's no longer an excuse to say, I didn't get it, it's there. So, what else we got here? All right. Get into some specific redundancies here. And redundancies are really the heart of over specifying. And here's an example. I pulled this offline. The paragraph on the left is what it says in the spec section. And so you can see what it says. It's flat roof insulation, ASTM C578 Type 4. On the right is a little clip from ASTM C578, and for some odd reason the specifier said, well, I think I better go a little bit further than just specifying the ASTM and the type number. And so he said, well, it's got to be R5. And you look over on the right, and well, it's already in there. The board size is not in the specification, the standard.
But who the heck cares? But who cares about the board size?
Well, some people do actually. This is, I believe, this is for roofing insulation, and I know there are some people that like to limit it to 48 inches square and stuff like that. So you might make an argument for that. Thickness references, as indicated on the drawings, that's the same thing as we're seeing on the drawings. You don't do that. Compressive strength, all these things are in the ASTM. The one interesting thing is that, what was it, the water absorption? They specified a different absorption, and I don't know why that is. I can't say that. So anyway, by using reference standards, if you know what they say, you can avoid a lot of stuff. And some of the standards are, I mean, they're voluminous. You look at like the Gypsum Association standards or the Steel Door Institute, or what's the other one, HMMA. By incorporating those standards, you have specified a whole ton of things in one sentence or one paragraph. And so if you go back and you say, all right, you regurgitate something that was already in there, you're emphasizing that, I guess, and saying this is more important. And I used to have a file of articles I got that were on case law, and I wish I still had it, but there was one where a jury decided that because the architect had emphasized one thing but not another, the contractor didn't have to do the other thing. So, again, you've incorporated a standard, and everything in that standard has to be complied with according to the contract. On the other hand, like I said, you have to know your standards. And when I first got into this business, I had been on a job as a specifier for a couple of weeks, and I got a call from the field, and the contractor wants to know what kind of pipe to use for a bollard. And so I'm pretty sure that's in the specs. So I went and looked, and sure enough, it was in there. And it said, it was ASTM A53, that's all it said. So I went and looked up that ASTM. I thought, well, I should be able to nail this down. Well, it turns out the title itself suggests you need to say more than simply ASTM A53. And as it turns out, there's 3 types of pipe, 2 grades, and 11 pages of cable. So simply referring to a reference standard isn't always enough. Some of them it is, but other ones, you really have to know your standards in order to work. I don't know, there's other things too. I mean, little things again. You see carefully remove this or something like that. Adjectives in general, unless they're defined.
I'm in the middle of a...
But anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. A couple of years ago, in fact, last year at the convention, I stuck my neck out that you should be able to specify just about anything in half a page. And the example I used was roofing. And if I say that I want a 60 mil EPDM membrane, and I give the wind load, fire rating, state any options that are in the manufacturer's material or in literature. And of course we have Division 1 that requires the contractor to comply with the manufacturer's instructions and all those other things. I'm not sure what else I have to say about it. You might have an exception though. Like if the manufacturer's standard is to run flashing 4 inches up a wall and you want it to be 8 inches, well fine, then you'd say that. Here's my exception. Flashing goes up the wall 8 inches. And there was a CSI member there who was a fairly well-known roofing consultant, and I thought, oh boy, here it comes. He raised his hand, and I said, all right, he's going to tell me I'm wrong. And he said, you are wrong. He said, you don't even need a half a page. So I think, you know, if we have, as I said in my last article, if we have faith in our own documents, there's a lot of stuff we don't need to do that we are doing right now. And you might say, well, so what's the big deal? Well, getting back to the general conditions, if you cross that line and venture into means and methods, you are assuming the contractor's liability. Now, if you happen to know more than the contractor, you know more about all these things than somebody else does, and you want to override the specifications, the manufacturer's specifications, that's fine, go ahead. But if you're not sure, it's probably not a good idea to be taking on that kind of liability. So that's
Sheldon.
my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, Sheldon, we have a number of questions for you.
Oh, good. I hope so. I thought maybe everybody left.
No. They're waiting until the end. Now they're ganging up on you.
All right.
So we have a question from Tommy Smith.
Oh boy.
Asking,
hi Tommy.
how many requirements included in the specifications are there to aid the contractor in the division of the work?
How many are there to aid the contractor? Why would you want to tell the contractor how to divide the work up? I guess I would ask.
That's that's a major change in the way we do specifications. I have a couple of textbooks from the very early 1960s, which is actually before I started college, and that I've accumulated over the years, and they actually go out of the way to try to explain how to write spec sections around the scope of trade contracts. But I'm sure glad we don't have to do that anymore.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of this stuff really
but the mechanical and electrical and plumbing engineers sometimes do not fully understand that, and that's why they will often repeat requirements for sealants, painting, through penetration fire stopping in their divisions that would normally be covered in what are sometimes called the architectural divisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we do a lot of things. We do a lot of repetition, a lot of redundancies, a lot of saying things over. Isn't that all the same? Another, go ahead. What other question? I don't know how to answer that.
Well, here's one from Karen Wood asking, what do your insurance company and attorney think of these suggested changes?
Well, I haven't talked to them, but I guess I would have to say they're pretty defensible. I mean, I'm looking at what the general conditions say I have to do, and that's what I'm doing. There's nowhere in the general conditions or in the owner-architect agreement that says the architect has to tell the roofer how to put roofing on, or how to tell the contractor how to divide his work or schedule it. There's nothing that requires that.
Right, and I would argue just from my own practice that if I can tell the contractor what it is that I want, and if I can say it in 5 words instead of 10, it's actually more defensible because there's less likelihood of any confusion. So we have another question here from Yolanda Jolly asking, is it reasonable to expect the contractor to have access to all the standards?
Why not? I mean, that's practically speaking, that's a good question. But if you are, for instance, a drywall installer, then I would think that you should be aware of those standards that apply to your work. And certainly the prime contractor is no more likely to have all that stuff than we as the architects are. I mean, I have the ASTMs, the 4-volume set. It's actually on CD, but I have that set. I have shelves full of standards. I have access to them. And like I said, you have to know what's in them, but the person who's doing the job is also supposed to know what's in them. That's their job. And no, I wouldn't expect the prime contractor to have everything, but still the people that are actually doing the work, the specific work, that's part of their job in my opinion. That's why we hired him, right?
That's right. I want to skip down to a question from Mike McVitie. He says, okay, I'm buying the argument. So who writes an effective set of specs based on one-page sections?
Nobody that I know of.
I would agree. Absolutely. Lewis mentioned his baggage handling spec, and I just reviewed one this morning for an elevator that was 57 pages.
Okay, yeah, there's a great...
Not to say that those were good examples necessarily, but
right.
There are complex systems. A baggage handling system is insanely complicated, and for one thing, it should have been broken up into a number of smaller sections of reduced scope, so that you have the conveyors and you have controls, or whatever, to make it a lot more accessible.
Yeah. But, okay, and using elevators as an example, I mean, what's up with elevators?
And then we have to distinguish between Tommy Smith some years ago wrote a really interesting article about how to specify different kinds of products. You have stuff that comes out of a box, and you screw it to the wall or to the roof deck, and you don't need any installation instructions. But you have other things like a tile floor that is in effect manufactured at the site that require a little bit more description on what is required.
That's true, but using the Tile Council standards as a reference, I mean, you've covered a lot of that stuff. Same thing with casework. if you incorporate the AWS standards. But I'm sorry, I got to get back to your elevator because that's always one of my favorite examples. I look at those 50-page elevator specs, and there's a whole page of the stuff there that's already on the drawings. They say there are so many, it stops at so many floors. Well, yeah, that's what the drawings tell me. It tells me, I don't know, where the doors are located and how they open and things. I've talked to a number of 3 or 4 elevator reps, and I asked them. I said, well, first of all, I said the elevator is probably the most highly regulated piece of equipment in the building. There are so many codes and standards that apply to it. It's pretty well covered. And I asked these guys. I said, all right, if I were to tell you the speed, the capacity, the cab dimensions, and what I want for alarm or backup if I need that, and what color I want in the cab, what kind of buttons I want on the wall, and where they go, what else do I need to tell you? And they said basically nothing, because everything else is dictated by code. And I like looking at the elevator specs because they have really profound statements in them, like the floor supports shall support the floor. I mean, come on. I don't think we need to specify that.
Yeah, I especially like this one I saw this morning because of the 57 pages, the first 6 were the summary article. And
wow.
the summary article ended with a definitions listing where the elevator spec defined defective work, which is included in the conditions of the contract.
It's also kind of asking for trouble, isn't it?
You would think.
Another one of my favorites is landscaping. I had a project a few years ago where, they have the nice big rubber, well, this is more than a few years ago. You had the rubber stamps, to put the icons on the drawings, So you had like 6 oak trees, and, you could count them. And there was a schedule on the drawings, and it said there were like 5, and then the specifications had a schedule too, and that probably said there were 7. I don't remember the exact numbers, but all 3 were different, Sometimes repetition is not always good.
Right.
Liz O'Sullivan has an interesting comment. She says, inexperienced project architects and many CMs will have a hard time enforcing a spec that relies heavily on reference standards. The specifier and installer may be the only people who know when an installation doesn't meet spec. Would the owner be well served by this? And we had an earlier comment from someone who suggested that this would be a good topic to discuss in a future SPG meeting.
Right, just the reference standard aspect.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's a great idea. We'll put that on the schedule.
Okay. So, and my response to that is, all right, so you have, say, the Gypsum Association standards for drywall installation, which is lots of pages of lots of information. It doesn't matter whether you cite anything from that or not. The installer still is required to comply with all that. So if in your specifications you say, and offhand, say the framing has to be 16 inches on center, I don't know, something that's in the standard that you don't need to repeat. So if you say that, or you pick 10 things that you're really concerned about, does that mean the contractor doesn't have to comply with all the rest of it? And the answer is no. He still has to comply with all the rest of that stuff. And not only that, but, and believe me, I like contracts. I don't think they're as evil as I see a lot of people saying, like on floor specs and stuff, like, these guys are really nasty. Or maybe I've just been lucky, but I don't think they're necessarily looking for ways to get out of things, but if you give somebody a checklist of 10 things to do, they're going to concentrate on that 10 things, and all the things you didn't talk about, which are in that standard that you referenced, they're not so likely to go in there and find that. And this came up, actually I'm going to mention this little clip here from my presentation, but I also had this theory is that you could have 2 project manuals, one for the contractor, and that would be all your half-page spec sections. The other one would be your in-house one, so that your CA guys, who can't know all the things any more than I can or the contractor can, but they have their own project manual, which is loaded up with all the stuff that you think is really important. I mean, you're still saying, you're still not saying that the contractor doesn't have to do the rest of it, but face it, we don't live on the site we aren't there all the time. We can't know if the contractor's done everything supposed to be done. But at least you can have a list of some big things you can look for and, hope for the best. I mean, really, that's what this is, yeah.
Hey, Sheldon, we have one comment from Cliff Marvin, and I think you will like this one because we want to make sure that you have plenty to do. It says,
Okay.
I think that specifiers should be doing more field observations.
I agree. Like how I
Vivian Volz
we should be there.
raises an interesting question that's a challenge to all of us who are active in CSI. Any suggestions for getting engineers on board with streamlining specs? I've redlined out pages of requirements that repeat or conflict with Division 1. And of course, that's the weakest area of our membership, is not having enough engineers. But I am in sympathy with that. I once had a section from an engineering consultant many years ago who had a single sentence that had nearly 200 words. Now, the usual rule of thumb is 26 words is the limit for a sentence that you can hold in your mind as one discrete thing and understand it. Otherwise, you have to break it mentally into smaller sections. So that's easy to remember, 26 words. But yes, we do find that. Would you like to comment on that? Are you able to get your engineering consultants to be terse and brief and
Actually,
talk?
two short stories in there. One is several years ago, we did a project with a local government agency, and they happened to have a CSI member there, and they were it was required that the documents be properly coordinated, as in the manual practice and standards and all that kind of thing. And so I had this meeting with our regular mechanical electrical consultants. I took lunch over there. I had a slideshow and everything. They said, here's what we're going to do. And we went through those very things. You've got all this stuff in your mechanical and electrical sections, and we already said that here, so we're going to take that out. And we went through a whole list of things. Worked out great. Entered the project manual back in the specification competition back when we used to have that. Won an award for it. And so I mailed copies of that to everybody and said, this is really great. Now we can just, keep on doing this. And their answer to me was, oh no, we just did it for that project.
Well, Sheldon, I once had there was a mechanical engineer consulting engineer that wanted to do work for my previous firm, and we finally let him do a small project. And when I got their specs, I was surprised that it was essentially their spec master, and it not. Mm-hmm. And I called the guy and said, "You didn't edit this to be project specific. Do you want the contractor to edit the specs to try to figure out what applies and what doesn't apply?" And he says, "Well, if that's your attitude, we don't want to work for you." I said, "Fine."
Fine. You're on.
Hey, Sheldon, we're up against the hour, but we have one more question for you from Cheryl Dodd-Hansen, asking which of the two project manuals that you're suggesting for the field and for your CA staff, which of those two do you give to the attorney?
Stick with the one you gave to the contractor. Of course, there's discovery, so we'll get the other one. But again, that's just an aid for us. I mean, we all have checklists and things. So it's basically a checklist for your CA to go out in the field.
Right.
I still say the other one is the half-page specs. I mean, easy to write, easy to bid. I mean, roofing spec section again. You run 10, 12 pages, and face it, most of that is regurgitated out of manufacturer's instructions anyway. So now if you wanted that 8-inch flashing or something in there, now the challenge is for the bidder to go through all those pages and find out what it is you want different from what they normally do. So anyway, easy to write, easy to bid, and I'd say easy to enforce, because you go back to the general conditions and say, I'm sorry, but it says right here that that's your responsibility, and it says right here it's not mine.
We have, there's one last comment I think that would make a good closing comment from Claude Pullen. He says that AIA contract documents come in sizes for buildings design of different complexity, why not specifications to correspond? And I think we all agree with that. That we know that the GSA, for example, is going to want a level of formality that a private client does not need, does not require. And obviously, if we are allowed to write proprietary specs, those can be a lot shorter than if we have to write descriptive specifications where we have to describe all of the attributes of a project and we're not allowed to name names. But we are at the end of our hour. Thank you very much, Sheldon.